Okay, welcome everybody to the second half of the slides on early Christian and Byzantine art. In fact, timing for if there was anyone here who didn't see Monday's slides, of course, those will be posted by Friday on YouTube as usual. But the most important ones for this topic, this week's topic, are coming up. And I'm going to tell you right now that at least one of the slides we're going to see, there's only, I think it's three more. Well, I cut one of them, so that leaves only three that will be from the syllabus, that will be must-knows. One of those at least will be on the final. As I'll tell you when we get to any slide. Okay, welcome Elijah. We're just saying that one of the slides you're going to see in today's Zoom class will be on the final. And I will tell you two of the three are really important, meaning they have a high probability of one or the other being on the final. I'll tell you when we get to them. First, I just want to confirm I've gotten almost everybody's first paper, but there's still, I think it's two people they haven't yet. So I hope those people, assuming they haven't just dropped without officially dropping, according to the enrollment numbers, they're still in the class. On my roster anyway, you do want to get that paper done as soon as possible. If you can get it in maybe by the end of this week or this weekend, that would be helpful for your sake. Okay, and extra credit options, I've already covered them, so I'm not going to restate those. We did that in detail at the beginning of the Monday afternoon class. But does anybody have any questions before we get started with today's slides? Oh, one more thing. I am going to show you my own slides, and as always, you can stop taking notes and just relax and listen. Of one of the most incredible, it's both an exotic and, well, all three beautiful, and some would say romantic, some say that those are synonymous terms. Any exotic city is by definition romantic. That's up to each person who sees such places. But I can tell you, Istanbul, Turkey, there are very few cities as fascinating as that. So I'll just show you some of the highlights from my own visit there. Over the years I've shown these, people have usually enjoyed those, and those are ones you won't have to take notes on. So we'll probably still end a little early today since we only have 3 slides left on the lecture, and then I'll tell you when I switch to the slides of my own that won't be on the test, of course. Okay, so let's do this. Are we missing anybody? Still waiting to, okay. Any questions one more time about extra credit, grades, or anything in general? I've seen some emails from all 3 of my classes since the spring break about people that somehow didn't get the grade on their first paper yet, if they turned it in by now, of course, or midterms. And I've sent them to everybody, but once in a while they go astray. If you don't find them in your spam folder, of course, send me a direct email, because probably the problem is that the email handle, I guess, or name on your email address didn't match your name on my roster, and then it isn't always in my computer. And then I just can hit reply and give you your grade quickly that way. Okay, no questions right now? All right, let's get to our first slide for today. And this one isn't actually a must know, or I took it off the list, but I just want to show this to you. Let's make sure you guys can see it, right? This is the interior of the church we looked at the end of Monday's lecture, which was on the syllabus and hasn't been removed. And that would be, you don't have to write this. There's no notes for this slide. The next one will be the first must know for today. But this is the interior of San Vitale. We saw the exterior, just as a refresher in case you weren't here. That's this. This is still on the study list. But this isn't. I just think it's interesting to see what the interior of one of these Greek Orthodox churches looks like. This is one of the arms of the Greek cross floor plan, where the 4 arms of the cross are exactly equal length. In other words, the 4 wings of the building extending outward in 4 directions are all the same length. That's what we mean by Greek cross floor plan. And then here's an apse, if it's not obvious, a semicircular extension along the wall of a Greek Orthodox church, which supports everything above it, the rest of this, the top part of the wall and the big heavy dome above it. These are frescoes and mosaics. It depends on which. I've never been inside this church, so some of them are frescoes, but actually most of them would be mosaics. So I gave you No, I didn't yet. That'll be a new definition we'll get to with the very next must-know slide. What is a mosaic? The Byzantines were the best of all ancient cultures. They were by far the best mosaic artists, and you'll see why we say that with the next slide. I just thought you'd find this that's supposed to be Jesus giving, a sermon to followers while he was still on earth. And of course, the followers are shown as sheep. And there he is up in heaven with a bunch of angels. Okay, so let's go to the first must know for today. This is a slide that I always do this when I get to one of these. It's so important that it will definitely not be cut from the study list for the final. So you should make sure you take extra good notes on it. The title of this one is Emperor Justinian Mosaic. And I'll spell his name, Emperor Justinian, Justian, Mosaic. I think some of you know that word, but I'll spell it. Mosaic. The location it's actually inside that church we saw at the end of the Monday lecture. It's inside San Vitale. It wasn't on the wall I just showed you. It's on another wall. So it's inside the church in Ravenna is the location, the city of Ravenna, Ravenna, 547. Remember, all the dates from now are a common era or AD. So you don't have to worry about those letters after any date on the final. Okay, so what's a mosaic? Well, that's our next definition. And it's not a long definition. Okay, so a mosaic is a two-dimensional work of art made up of thousands of tiny pieces of colored glass, period. Again, a mosaic is a two-dimensional work of art made up of thousands of tiny pieces of colored glass. And I already said this, but I'll repeat it. So for the first fact on the meaning of this slide, she probably should start with the fact that the Byzantines, now I did spell that right culture's name, but if you weren't here on Monday, Byzantine, this was the empire that survived after the fall of Rome, the eastern half, what once was originally the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And they had their own capital city, which is today Istanbul. Back then it was called Constantinople, because it was founded by Constantine. We covered all this on Monday, and that, again, will be on the video of that lecture posted on YouTube by Friday night. So what does that mean? That means that this is an example of the highest art form, right, of the Byzantine culture. When they ruled, and this is one of the more important facts, Justinian is the emperor, and there he is right in the middle. If it's not obvious, he's wearing, and I'll explain why as part of the meaning when we get a little further into this, the notes here. He's wearing both a crown and a halo. I might as well go ahead and just say why. Why would he be doing that or being shown this way? Because he was considered both, obviously, the ruler of the empire. He was the top person, of course, the political ruler or leader of the Byzantine Empire. So that's where the crown comes from. The halo is just meant to show that he was also considered a holy person. Someone like a holy person on earth, not a god literally, but holier than all other humans. And that made him the head of the Byzantine church. And that would be what Greek Orthodox churches are. They are houses of worship for Eastern or Byzantine Orthodox worshipers. There's still hundreds of millions of people. There's 500 million Eastern, well, almost, including Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Bulgaria, and tens of millions of Eastern Orthodox worshipers in this country. And in Canada, there's several million. They're quite a major world denomination within the Christian church. So this guy was then the head at the time this mosaic was made. Justinian was both the head of the church, of the Byzantine church, and of the empire. That's why he has both a crown and a halo. Okay, but what's going on here is he's meeting with his advisors, or the right word would probably be ministers. Now, I know Stockstead, unless they change in the most recent edition, I haven't seen the last edition they printed, but it's completely inaccurate to call this Justinian and his attendants. because these are not attendants, those are servants. These guys ain't nobody's servants. They're the top people in the empire. They are his advisors, sort of like president's cabinet would be, in America today. So these are civilian advisors. They're the ones dressed in white robes. And then these are his military advisors. Like, again, if you want to draw a parallel with the modern world, you could say the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which, are the heads of the military branches that the president meets with regularly. So these are generals here, for the cavalry, the artillery, the infantry of the Byzantine army. Now, here are the other parts of the meaning that I'll say them slowly and repeat them that are important, because that's why this slide, I'm not cutting it, because Justinian was the most powerful man in the Western world during his lifetime, during his reign. He ruled over the Byzantine Empire for over 40 years. First of all, that's unusual, right, for any king or emperor to be on the throne that long. And he was the one, him personally, as head of the Byzantine Empire, who was responsible for reconquering 2/3 of the old Roman Empire. His army and navy under his leadership re-established most, you could just say, of the old Roman Empire by expanding westward across the entire Mediterranean. They ruled all of the countries that border the Mediterranean, all the way through Europe, Spain, down into North Africa, Egypt, Arabia. This is before Muhammad. Islam didn't exist then. So they spread Christianity around to those areas of Europe and North Africa and the Middle East, from where their empire originally was, which was just what's now Turkey and Greece. And they expanded them immensely. And he was the one that did that. So that makes him a pretty important person in the history of the ancient world. Two more facts about him, and that'll be the main points you should have in your notes if it's on the final of the essay part of the questions. The second fact that makes him a really important person is that he created the Justinian Code of Law, or Justinian law codes. But those are still used in many parts of the world, like many Latin American countries still base their laws on the codes that of course, he didn't write them all. He was a little busy, but he hired, legal experts and judges and things, and decided which laws should be enforced and what the punishments were. Those codes, the Justinian law codes, are still the basis of many countries, including several in Europe and Latin America. To this day, they're still the basis for many laws. What is 1,500 years later? And then the third thing that he did was to create a modern bureaucracy. Now, if you've been to the DMV lately or dealt with the unemployment department, you'll probably go, oh, great, we have him to blame when you can't get government to function right. Well, that's not the point. That, of course, the point is that when he created this system, there hadn't been any organized public officials who were hired, at least supposedly, before, because of the skill they had to do whatever job it was, whether it was, maintaining the roads or running the law courts, the judicial system, or libraries or public, works and all. So he created a whole concept that had never been. Now the Chinese were doing that. They were doing that even before, but not, you think of Rome, didn't they do that? It was nepotism in Rome. It was who you knew and maybe who your family members or, your in-laws were that got you your jobs, and the people doing those public service jobs, whatever they were, might be competent, might not. Well, he insisted that people have to be trained as professionals to fill these public service sector jobs. It's a modern concept. Today, it supposedly is what makes society work in most of the world. It's the first society in the West, you always have to say Western world, to have that kind of system. And again, he enforced those rules at least as much as he could while he was emperor. So he's a pretty influential person in the history of the world. Excuse me, let me take a second here. Okay, so let's get to the formal elements here. But before we do that, I always ask this because one of my students, one of the first 2 or 3 years I taught this course, noticed this about these 4 generals here. Well, actually 3. So I meant 3 generals and the guy over here. Look at their faces for a moment and look at their features, their haircuts, even their expressions. Do they look like they might resemble a certain singing group that used to be the top rock and roll band in the world? They were from a different part of, not from the US. Anybody know what I'm talking about? John, Paul, George, and Ringo, they have a strange resemblance to the Beatles circa 1968, about the time of the White Album. If you've ever seen that photos they took when they had that kind of hairstyle and facial hairs. It's just an odd mystery of history. No one knows how or why these four guys look a lot more like a modern, relatively modern rock band than they do ancient Byzantine generals. Okay, but obviously you wouldn't put that on the exam if this question is in the final exam. All right, let's do our formal analysis. Well, Justinian is the largest mass, so that's an easy one to do. And then the next largest mass would be the guy next to him. By the way, I didn't mention, it's part of the meaning you could add, you don't have to, but this guy was the head of the Byzantine church on a day-to-day basis. In which he actually ran the church hands-on, whereas the final authority for all questions relating to Byzantine religion would be the emperor, Justinian. So he doesn't have a halo, but he's got the cross. There it is, the Greek cross that we've been talking about, where the churches have the same shape. The Greek Orthodox churches have the equal arm cross. So that means he's, not quite like a pope, like one step below pope. So he's the head of the, daily administration of the church. That's why he's standing next to the emperor, and he's the second largest mass. And it's pretty much equal with the other advisors, civilian advisors, or ministers, you could say, in white robes. They're almost all the same mass, the other 5 or 6. For space, the only technique is overlapping. There really isn't any other space technique here. Obviously, the robes overlap each of their bodies, and they overlap the people next to them, except for the emperor. He's the only one that's out completely in full view. The modeling is typical of Byzantine mosaics. The modeling is very strong and very heavy, you could say, and the lines, therefore, are thick. They're thin on their faces, like Paul here and George. Actually, these are the 4 I meant to say that look a little bit like the Beatles. But their facial features would have, you could just say, thin lines on pretty much only on their faces. The rest of their entire physiques have all the outlines are bold outlines around their arms and hands and their clothing. And then we have colors. Well, warm in the background. Every Byzantine icon or mosaic use this, which is that they put a gold background. They just love the color gold. There's real gold, actually, gold in the pieces of colored glass itself. And so that's warm, obviously. And then it's cool, of course, on the purple and white robes of the civilian advisors, and then on the green and purple of some of the generals. But then there is some warm, of course, a little bit on the sleeves, a couple of them, and on the church, head of the church, of the Byzantine church, part of his robes. Their facial features have, as all skin tones, remember, are considered warm. And then we have the rhythm is obvious with the arms, hands, heads, folds of their robes. And it's balanced. He's right dead in the center. And even though the number of people on the left or to the left of him, of the emperor, is a greater total, but the area covered by the figures is roughly equal. And it's definitely balanced top to bottom. There's empty space below their feet, and there's a little bit about the same amount above their heads. And then we have stable almost entirely. The only things dynamic are the top of their heads, and well, of course, the crown and halo on Justinian's head, above his head. So mostly stable because they're standing straight upright. Okay. Oh, textures, yes, very good similar textures, as all Byzantine mosaics would have had on their hair, their clothing, and the objects they're holding. Okay, this is the next must know. And this one is icon of Virgin and Christ. Icon, I-C-O-N, of Virgin and Christ. The location today, it's a city that you're going to see some slides of in a little bit, Istanbul, which is not the capital of Turkey, for what that's worth. You don't have to know that fact, but a lot of people state that. It's just the largest city in Turkey. Istanbul is I-S-T-A-N-B-U-L. And the little C's you can ignore when you see those letters. You can just write 1200 or 11's apostrophe S, because the 12th century means the 1100s. Everybody knows that by now, how the numbers line up. Which century are we in? The first, even though it's 2022. So you can either write 12th century or 1200 or 1100s. Any of those will, if it's on the exam. I'm not saying it's so important, it might not be cut, but for now, assume it could be on the final. So last definition for this week's topic, and it's a short definition, is below mosaics on your list of terms to know. Icon, ICON, of course. An icon is a sacred image that includes one or more of the following. A sacred image that includes one or more of the following. And, colon or semicolon would be God, Jesus, Mary, or other holy figures. So it could have all the above or just one. Again, I'll repeat that. An icon is a sacred image that includes one or more of the following, colon, God, Jesus, Mary, and or, I guess you say, and or other holy figures. So how does this qualify? Well, we've got Jesus there. We've got his mother, Mary, supposedly sitting on a throne that looks very familiar, doesn't it? Looks like something we saw in Rome. The slides I showed of Rome before the midterm. Yes, it looks like the Coliseum, but it's not the one in Rome. They had one in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. So she's sitting on a throne designed or made to look like the one in Istanbul. Well, now it's Istanbul, in the capital of the Byzantine Empire. And it was not a blood sports arena. They didn't allow it because the church now would take it over. So it was all family friendly entertainment. No blood was shed. Wrestling matches and contests, sporting contests, and plays and musical performances, that kind of thing. So all family friendly or non-violent, non-blood sport entertainment was done in the Coliseum. Although it looked much like the one in Rome, it was different in that way. So she's sitting on, a throne that's made to look like the Coliseum where this was made. This was made in Istanbul, what is now Istanbul. Now, the third holy figure here are these angels, right? Up in heaven, supposedly, looking down. We know all these figures, all four of them, Mary, Jesus, and the two angels are holy figures because they all have halos. This is a typically Byzantine painting. It is not a mosaic. This is a painting. It's not a fresco. It's a painting on wood. Most icons, some of you have seen them perhaps in gift shops. They have them all over the Bay Area where any Russian immigrant communities are, or in any old churches that are Eastern Orthodox. There's a couple of dozen here in Sonoma County. Churches, you could see these kinds of things inside. There are icons on display inside almost in every Eastern or Russian Orthodox church I've ever been in. So they would have painting on a piece of wood, and then it's on display on, hung from a wall or something. So that's what this is. This is not a mosaic. And the gold background, that's common to all Byzantine mosaics and frescoes and paintings, all icons done by the Byzantines. Okay, and then the last thing I'll mention is something bizarre. Take a close look at a little closer view of baby Jesus. I don't know about anyone else, but when I look at that, as one of my students said, again, in one of my early classes, that looks like a miniature 30-year-old man with a bad haircut. It doesn't look like a baby or a toddler, any normal one I've ever seen anyway. So it's also the color of the skin on both Mary and her so-called baby or toddler, her child, are dead flesh color. Look at them. The color of the skin is not at all like any normal living human being skin. And that's the last fact about the meaning you could add, which is that it's not that they didn't know how to portray the skin colors of what were then of, and of course, these were, European, right, cultures, the Byzantines. They just didn't have the pigments. They didn't have the kind of paints. They think, in other words, the reason why the color looks unlifelike on the skin tones in ancient mosaics and frescoes, many, not all, is because of the impurities in the paint, most historians think. Or it could even be it just turned that color over the centuries, from the air. So we'll never know because no one had color photos, obviously, when these were made. So this is an icon. All right, formal analysis, do a real quick one. And the last slide is the most important one for this whole week. The next must know. But let's wrap this one up. It's obviously balanced with her dead center in the middle. Two angels, one equal distant on either side of her head, and her head being almost the same. You know, it's obviously balanced. There is empty space here, but there is two below. By the way, the slide is cut off. It should go to the bottom of the screen. So you'd see almost exactly the same empty space below her seat and above. Very close. So it's roughly balanced top to bottom and definitely symmetrical left to right. The rhythm is obvious. The seat she's on, designed to look like the Coliseum, as all these windows and you know, details. And then her robes, of course, their heads, their arms and hands. Same with the two angels, it's the same shape. Lots of rhythm. It is mostly stable. If you look carefully, she is sitting upright. Baby, quote unquote, Jesus is upright, and the only part of the throne that's dynamic is the part behind her back. Even these angels are mostly stable. There's a slight tilt to their heads, but there's obviously dynamic details in the shape of all of four of the figures' heads. Okay, and it's a warm background, of course, with the gold, the red robes. And the skin tones is not so much, but originally we'll just think maybe they probably were a little closer to real warm skin tones. And then it's cool, of course, on her undergarments or underrobes, the blue part, and on the details of the angels. The lines are all bold. The modeling is strong, especially on the robes of both Jesus and Mary. And then let's see, the largest mass, that's pretty easy. Her, then the throne, and then Jesus. Okay, and the textures are pretty realistic, not super sharp, but on their faces and their hair, they are a little less realistic on the clothing. Okay, this is the most important slide, like I said, not just for today's lecture, but for this whole topic. High possibility, if not probability, of being on the final. So this is the Hagia Sophia, two words. First word, Hagia, then Sophia is Sophia. The architects, if you put Istanbul, though that is where it is in the city of Istanbul, you wouldn't get credit. You'd miss several points on the answer. Whatever's on the syllabus, of course. We know the architects' names. We didn't used to, at least I never used to see them in any textbooks, but now most historians list this as the two architects. All right, so their names were Artemis and Isidorus. That's Artemis, and Isidora is Isodorus, 537. So what are we looking at? We're looking at the largest, the interior, of course, the interior of the largest dome building ever built in the ancient world. Even today, it's one of the largest dome buildings on Earth. 15 centuries after it was built, it's still one of the largest. But when it was built, it was the largest dome building ever built in the ancient world. And obviously, that would mean that it was then the largest dome building on the planet. Pretty remarkable, because we already remember we saw the Pantheon. It was actually, I believe that was on the midterm, right? And that was the largest dome building ever built by the Romans. Well, Rome is gone now. When this was built, Rome had, a century earlier, had disappeared as an empire, been conquered by invaders, right? But not the Byzantines. This was built during Justinian's time. In fact, he ordered the construction and hired the architects. So it's how big? Well, that's part of the meaning, and we'll repeat this with the formal analysis when we get to space. Obviously, space, remember, is the dimensions of a building, mostly of the interior, when it comes to formal analysis. I'll repeat that, but for now, it's part of the meaning, okay? The dome is 182 feet high and over 180 feet wide. That's 40 feet taller than the dome in Rome of the Pantheon. You could fit the Pantheon inside this building and its dome wouldn't even come close to touching the top. It's mind-boggling. I will show you my own slides of it when we finish with this one, and you can just see for yourself why it's such an impressive sight. If you ever get a chance to go to Istanbul, or even just watch 100 different movies, or probably at least 40 or 50 that have been filmed with scenes inside this building, because it's so spectacular. Okay, so it's original dome. It's not been replaced. It's been damaged in earthquakes and, various over time that needed repair, but the dome is still mostly the original dome created 15 centuries ago. Now, the other facts about it are that it encompasses, remember Greek Orthodox churches all have the same three main concepts. So this is the cross floor plan. And I think you can see that if you were to walk around the corners here, let's do a little close up, you'd see the other two arms of the cross. So you've got this one and the one that's, behind the photographer, right? Where the photographer is facing. So it actually encompasses, this building encompasses, you could say, or, incorporates, if you prefer, the equivalent of 4 city blocks within the building. I don't know another church that you could say that. Even the biggest Christian church in the world, which is St. Peter's in Rome, doesn't have that dimension to it. It's the longest of all Christian churches, but this is one of the largest churches still to this day. Interior space of this, one of the largest 4 city blocks encompassed within or included within the walls. Each one of those 4 arms of the Greek cross is the equivalent of a city block in length. And here's the dome on pendentives. That's just the bottom of the dome. I have my own slides of it, but you can't really get a slide. It's impossible to get a slide that shows everything from the floor all the way to the top of the dome, which is too big. So you just have to imagine the dome going like 40 or 50 feet above the base. That's the base of the dome. It's resting on the corners of the walls, literally. That's what the phrase means. I held up that hand-done drawing I had, right, of the 3 features of all Greek Orthodox churches, and you will need to know that for it'll be probably on more than one section of the final, on the true false section, probably, based on your definitions. Since I've already given that to you, I won't restate the 3 features, but one of those 3 features of all Greek Orthodox churches is that the dome is resting on the corners of the building. That's what is meant by a dome on pendentives. This is actually technically what the word pendentive means, but it's just a way of saying that the dome is not resting on the outer walls. It's resting on the corners, which makes it way stronger. The dome can go much higher. Obviously, this one is bigger than any Roman dome ever built. And then apses, well, there we go. These are a series of 4 apses, one very large apse because it's such a heavy dome, it needs an extra large apse, which itself needs support. So that larger apse is supported by 3 smaller apses within the big one. And then 2 more facts about it. These columns are 40 feet high, and the ones up above were 20 feet. And all of these columns, or almost all of them, I think not, maybe 2/3, just say the majority of the columns were brought from ruined Roman temples that had been abandoned centuries before. Because remember, this once was part of the Roman Empire for hundreds of years before it became the capital, this city of Constantinople. So they brought these marble columns that were, still intact, maybe fallen down, but not broken, and recycled them, reused them, many of them, not all of them. And then finally, why is there Arabic writing inside a Greek Orthodox church? Well, I didn't actually say this, I should have. This is the mother church of the Greek Orthodox religion. It is the mother church, just like St. Peter's is the mother church of the Catholics. And the temple in Jerusalem would have been the mother synagogue of Jews. It's not anymore functioning, it's just a ruin. But any, headquarters of a particular large world religion is a pretty important building just for that fact. So I'll say that again. One other fact about the meaning. This is the mother church of the Byzantine religion. Remember, Byzantine and Greek Orthodox, synonymous. The 2 words mean the same thing in terms of the historical origins. So this was their mother church, and that's why it had to be so big and impressive. But why are there Arabic shields with Arabic writing? Because the Turks took over, conquered the Byzantine Empire. It took them centuries, but they eventually took over this city. And when they did, they converted the mosque, Hagia Sophia, the church, into a mosque. And they put these prayer shields up with their own Arabic prayers. Now, the Turks don't speak Arabic, as I'm sure some of you know, right? But they are supposed to pray along with their, religious services in their mosques in Arabic, or at least the imam does. So that's why there were Arabic prayer shields, is what they are. Or you could just say Islamic prayer shields, because it was converted into a mosque. And for centuries, Christians were allowed to worship here on Sunday by the Turks. Pretty enlightened for, this was in the Middle Ages by the time the Turks took over. So I'll say it again, this was a functioning mosque after it had been a Eastern Orthodox cathedral or Byzantine cathedral for nearly 1,000 years. Then for several centuries, it was a mosque. And lastly, what happened for almost 100 years, it was non-functioning as a religious structure. It was just a museum open to everyone. That's when I went there and saw it. And now, because of the dictator of Turkey, basically, he's a dictator, the current ruler of Turkey has converted it back into a mosque, and Christians aren't allowed to worship there anymore, which I think is unfortunate, but they weren't before. When it was a museum, it was just for tourists. So it's back to being a functioning mosque. Okay, well, the very, very, very last fact on the meeting, I always mention it last, because if you think about a building this big, 4 city blocks inside the walls, the dome that was the tallest in the ancient world, and it's the original building, survived 15 centuries. Here we go. This is the last fact. Pretty remarkable. The entire structure from the foundation to the top of the dome was completed in 5 years. We can't do that today in America. It takes that long to build, a 10 or 15 or 20 story skyscraper in San Francisco, New York, Chicago, whatever. And it took 15 years to build half of the Bay Bridge to replace the part that collapsed in the earthquake of the late 80s. That's a remarkable achievement, that they could build a building this big, this impressive, and have it survive intact, basically intact for 15 centuries. And it only took them 5 years. Okay, formal analysis, and then we'll switch to just a few slides of Istanbul for your own interest and not to take notes. Completely symmetrical, as you might guess from the diagram I drew and what I've been saying. All Greek Orthodox churches, if they follow the requirements for that style, are going to be equal arm crosses by definition, balance left to right, and I would say top to bottom too. Although the dome is narrower than the wall, so you could make the case that it's unbalanced toward the bottom if you were to look at it from the outside. But in this slide, what you see, you just say it's balanced both directions, if this is on the final. The rhythm is obvious with the round arch windows, the apses, the columns, right? The arches above the columns, the prayer shield, the rhythm everywhere you look. It is both stable on the walls and the columns themselves, although they're round, so they're both. But of course, it's plenty of dynamic, or has plenty of dynamic arches in the windows and between the columns, and of course the apses and the prayer shield. It's warm mostly on the upper half because of the frescoes and mosaics. They're both frescoes and mosaics on the walls here. Some of them are Byzantine and a few were added by the Turks, but mostly they left the building the way you'll see in my own slides, the way it looked when they conquered it. And so there's all these 1,000, 1,500-year-old mosaics and frescoes. Those are all painted lines, right? So there's simulated texture on the angels. These are angels here. And then there are other holy figures or icons around the walls. It's all done with painted line. There is a visual line around the edges of the arched windows, of course. That's about the only modeling you can see. There is just the shadows near the bottom from the sun, created from the sun coming through the windows. There's no technique for modeling. The textures also are real. Obviously, they're on the upper half, mostly simulated, mostly real on the bottom half with real smooth marble. Those are all marble columns, and real smooth plaster on the walls, the sides of the building. It is, let's see, the largest mass. Well, in this slide, it's hard to tell, but I'll just tell you it is the dome. Unless you take everything below the dome as one mass, which it really isn't. So first, if you break it down to 3 or more sections, the largest mass is the dome. Then the tallest apse, or the larger apses, there's 4 of these on each wing, right? And then the bottom row of columns would be the 3rd largest mass. I'll repeat the space dimensions. It's the equivalent of 4 city blocks within the walls, the floor space, and the dome itself reaches a height of 180, you could just say a little over 180 feet and over 180 feet wide. So it's one large open dome room. with a dome that reaches a height of over 180 feet. And let's see, am I forgetting anything? Carved line, balance, rhythm, stable, dynamic, mass. I think that's it. Okay. All right, so I'm going to stop the share and I'll switch to, this will just take a minute or so, to my own slides of Istanbul and get them back up on. So it's not an easy place to go to now, of course, but it still hasn't, now that they've opened up their tourism industry. I know a few teachers who've gone there in the last few months when the pandemic finally becomes endemic, right? Hopefully it'll be even easier. And when I was,
wait, could you restate the colors and the
Sure.
texture?
Sure.
Again?
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. I meant to say, are there any questions before we move on to my own slides? Okay. Yes, the colors were mostly warm on the upper half inside the ISV, right? You're talking about, right? Because of the yellows and reds and gold colors of the frescoes and mosaics. And on the bottom half, the colors, I didn't say, did I apologize, were mostly cool because the columns have a kind of a grayish brown color, which is between cool and warm, but in that slide, they look mostly gray. So you could say it's mostly cool on the bottom. And then the prayer shields were both, if you recall, those were green backgrounds with gold lettering. So that makes the prayer shields, Muslim prayer shields, both cool and warm. Okay, so here we go. We're going to take a trip to Istanbul. But I know first what I have to do is get.
And then can you repeat texture again? Sorry.
Sure. The textures were simulated on the frescoes and mosaics, the paintings on the wall, and those were done with painted lime, of course, right? And then they were real on the smooth, real texture of the marble columns and the smooth, real texture of the plaster on the walls. Okay, so this should work as soon as we pull this up here. Get rid of this. Any other questions? Because I should have paused to ask you guys about what we just saw. Okay, here we go. Yeah, and of course I'll stick around at the end. I always do for any other questions you might have. All right, this is, I don't have to take any notes now. I'll just, 15 or 20 minutes maybe or so. We'll probably end about 4:05 or so, depending on if you guys have questions afterwards. I'll stick around as always. All right, these are, this is not the Hagia Sophia. This is just a mosque on the outskirts of Istanbul. And they're, of course, well, I didn't say this, the Turks, you don't have to know any of this. They conquered Istanbul in the 1400s. I'm sorry, it was then Constantinople, and then he renamed it and made it for a while their capital. It was the capital of the Turkish Empire, one of the biggest empires in the history of the world that, again, most people, the Americans at least, don't know anything about. But they ruled a big chunk of the three continents. They ruled all of North Africa, almost all the Middle East, and a big section of Southern Europe. And they kept invading Europe and almost got all the way to Vienna. That's pretty far from Turkey, if you look at a map. Were finally pushed back. But they had this empire that lasted 500 years. And so their buildings were reflecting the power and wealth of this giant empire, of which the capital was what's now Istanbul. Okay, so there's a mosque. You can tell by the, well, you don't know, we haven't covered Islamic architecture. We're doing that next week. The two minarets, some of you already know what those are, right? The round prayer towers. And here's another one with Arabic writing. You see now that it even almost looks like Egyptian hieroglyphics. In fact, it does. So I wonder if maybe that's what they were imitating. But I saw plenty of mosques in Turkey where they speak Turkic, not Arabic. But the educated people, the church officials, right, the imams and running each mosque, they have to speak and say their prayers in Arabic because that's in the Quran. Okay. So now we're going to go into the Hagia Sophia. This is how it looks from the outside. And that's that dome that's 182 feet high, but you're going to see it from the inside. And now it's been converted to a mosque. So guess what? The Turks added, actually, this is one of the only mosques I know of in the world that has 6 minarets. Normally 4 is the most you'd ever see, because in a royal mosque, meaning built by and for a sultan or emperor, an Islamic ruler, for his family's, his invited guest use, and then also the public when they were allowed in. those are called royal mosques, built at the order of the ruler. They always had 4 minarets, which is way more than most mosques only have 1 or 2. But this, the Hagia Sophia, now that's converted into a mosque and has been for most of the last 600 years, has 6 minarets. You'll see them from there. You go. Look at that. It looks, somebody said it looks like Emerald City of Oz in the Wizard of Oz. Not really, but this is the ruins of the Coliseum that once was in, you know, we saw in that icon where Mary and Jesus were sitting on a throne that looked like the Coliseum in Istanbul. Well, then it was Constantinople. So all that's left of it is just the foundation and some fallen columns. I think it was destroyed by the Turks. I'm pretty sure they thought it was set against their religion to have certain public entertainments that the Greek Orthodox Church used to hold. Okay, so let's go inside. Now, this is the Blue Mosque, which we are going to cover next week. And that is one of those royal mosques with 4 minarets. These are the minarets, 2 of the 6 that we just saw in the last slide. So in other words, the 2 buildings are side by side. And there's, we'll go into it now because it's getting ahead of ourselves next week when we cover Islamic architecture. I'll explain why are these 2 buildings side by side. It was a deliberate decision that the Sultan, one of the early Turkish sultans after they conquered Constantinople, decided, and there's a reason for that. We'll get to that later. Quite beautiful, the Blue Mosque. Now we're back to the Hagia Sophia. You can't see the other 2 minarets. They're off on the side here. So look at that dome. That dome has not had to be replaced. It's been cracked in earthquakes, and it was damaged during the Crusades when the Crusaders put their horses in here and used the church as a stable. Talk about disrespect. There we go. These are the 6 minarets. You see them. Let's walk between the minarets and go inside the Hagia Sophia. There are those apses we saw from the inside. Okay, now this is me lying on my back looking upward, but I think it's an interesting angle. But now you're going to see how, whoops, that's right, I forgot. This slide should have been before the other one. Here's the one of the, well, is there a front and back? Yeah, there is a main entrance to the church and to this, now again, a mosque, but originally was a church. And look at these massive concrete pillars. I don't know if you ever drove through the Central Valley or let alone the Midwest of the US where I grew up. These grain elevator looking structures help support, of course, the weight of the dome along with the corners of the building. Okay, now we're going to go through the interior. That ring of windows has a name given by the original Byzantine architects. They call it the ring of light, and some even say the ring of heaven, translated from Greek. By the way, the Byzantines spoke Greek, not Latin. And so that's why their religion is all called Greek Orthodox. But those windows are about 160 feet above the floor. Now, it's the details in this building that are almost as impressive as the dome itself. Look at the frescoes, or these are mosaics, actually. Sorry, you're going to see both frescoes, mosaics. Little tiny pieces of colored glass adhered. I'm not sure if they glue them or how they get them on the walls, but they've been there for 15 centuries. And then those marble columns that we saw earlier. And you can see the base of the dome looking straight up, but I'm going to show you a view of it straight directly into the dome in just a moment. These side aisles are where those columns that we talked about, the 40-foot high columns that they brought, many of which were brought from ancient Roman ruined temples. And then on the arches are these mosaics with various early Christian symbols. And then this looks like a train station in Paris or London, you know, from the 1800s, right? Some of you, or even some back east in the US. These massive train stations that, you know, when railroads were a new thing, they were building each big city that had a railroad station to impress, you know, the people that travel by train. Massive walls. That's actually looks more modern, doesn't it? Does it me than 15 centuries ago? That's concrete and metal framed windows. Those are the original windows and the original wall. There's the dome. But you just, there's of course, someone, I don't know how they did this. So the Turkish artist got up there and painted these Islamic prayers. Of course, that wouldn't have been there when the Byzantines ruled. This is an amazing structure. There's your ring of light, or the ring of heaven, as they call it. You can see something like that and you get 10 points extra credit if you go and take a picture, well, 4 pictures at the Marin County Civic Center. in San Rafael. Frank Lloyd Wright had been to Istanbul. He loved this building, and he was inspired to design the dome above the library reading room, of all places, on the top floor. You know, it's like a 4-story structure, right? The Marin County Civic Center, as you've seen it all when you drive down 101, right? So there's a hint for extra credit. You can go in it now, it's safe, and I don't think you even have to wear a mask. But if you're taking pictures and someone asks you what you're doing, you do want to tell them that you're in a class in art history. That many of my students have done this, so they're not surprised. But usually they don't care, as long as you aren't interfering with one of the court hearings and you're just in the hallways. But the library is open to everybody. And there is a similar feature. It's nowhere near this big, of course, on the ceiling of the Marin County Library. And let's go up close. There's those columns 40 feet on the bottom and 20 feet above. And now you see why everyone agrees, all art historians agree. The Byzantines were the greatest Mosaic artists of the ancient world. You see the Greek lettering? It's the same as almost the Russian alphabet, Cyrillic. The Russian alphabet is based on the ancient Greek alphabet. And the Byzantines were the ones that ruled over what's now Ukraine. Before there was a Russia, there was a Ukraine. That's why it's so ridiculous that Putin claims that Ukraine is not, it never was a separate country. Of course it was for centuries. This one is one of my favorites. That's Justinian. We just saw him wearing his formal robes, and he's giving money to Jesus, I guess. And there's your Greek cross, Jesus on his throne, and he's got his halo. And there's his wife, Theodora. She was an amazing woman. She was almost a co-ruler. She probably found the architects to design this and many other Byzantine churches during his reign. She had been a dancer, and he'd seen her at some theater, and they were very happily married and had many children, of whom became his successors, of course. It's during the golden age of that empire, you can almost tell, because the gold itself verifies it. And then look at these massive columns. If you haven't seen any of the movies filmed here, I'll give you a couple. Again, you could get extra credit. I'd accept that if you wrote about what you learned about the building. In the first, or is it second, James Bond movie with Sean Connery, From Russia with Love, there's a chase scene inside the Hagia Sophia. I think it's the first American or British and American movie made inside, filmed in part of it, inside the Hagia Sophia. Another more recent one is the International, and that's got, is it Clive Owen and Naomi Watts, yeah, as the two main characters. And there's a chase, and also the second Taken movie with Liam Neeson also has a chase scene inside this building. It's just such a popular site because there's nothing like it anywhere else in the world. This was, I think, a Halloween decoration. It's a spider web. I have no idea what that has to do with any religion. And these are symbols that I've had people actually say, isn't that the Pope's crown or headdress, the one the Pope's been wearing for centuries? I don't think it would be a Catholic image in a Greek Orthodox church, but it is similar to that. And then some of these mosaics are remarkable. We'll go through these more quickly because I want to end up with the Blue Mosque during a hurricane. A remarkable place to be in a hurricane. These are the later emperor, probably, centuries after Justinian. Again, they always seem to be giving something. In this case, it's two churches that were built by the Byzantines in some other part of their empire as a token or offering to Mary and Jesus. And then here are the angels that the Turkish soldiers, when they conquered the city, they almost wiped off all of the, where they started to, I should say almost, they started wiping off the Christian symbolism. And the Sultan at that time, the one that conquered this city, the last part of the Byzantine Empire to follow the Turks, like I said, it took them centuries to conquer it. This city held out for over 100 years against the Turkish army, which was huge. When he took over, he went inside the mosque, saw his soldiers scraping off some of the Christian icons, and he said, stop, don't do that. We should respect the culture that was here before us. Again, a very enlightened attitude for medieval Europe. It is part of Europe, by the way. In fact, Istanbul is the only city that spans two continents. It's the only city in the world that's true, both Asia and Europe. Half the cities in Europe, half in Asia. And we'll finish with a view of that. Bridge that joins the two continents. Okay, here again are those massive columns, 40 and 20 feet, and there's one of those giant Arabic prayer shields. And this is the exterior as you walk out into the daylight, and these massive buttresses that support it. But now, let's go take a walk through the city just for a few more minutes here. That is, of course, Hagia Sophia from a distance. And when I was there, this decades ago, there were almost as many old American cars on the street as there were in Havana, Cuba, when I went there much later. In Havana, I was there after 2000, about several times. And I think the ones in Istanbul have been sold to collectors, but not the ones in Cuba. This is a Roman aqueduct. I mentioned when I showed you that one must know before the midterm course, you can forget all about it. But that was the Pont de Garde, that was the largest single segment remaining portion of a Roman aqueduct. Well, here's one of the longer ones, so it's nowhere near as tall as the one in southern France. Obviously, it hasn't been used for traffic or anything else, foot traffic or anything else, because of the weeds growing on it for a long time. It's another view of it. And so let's take a walk in the Heritage District. They call it the oldest section of Istanbul. This was when the Turks took over the city. It was already pretty big, but they expanded it because it was their capital of a huge empire. So population boomed. And they built, what, 500 to 600 years ago, these wooden houses. Now, obviously, that's not that old, but you're going to see in the next slide, the streets, the cobblestones, the graveyards. It should be obvious these are Turkish turbans on top of graves of Turkish soldiers who fought for the empire. Whoa, 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 whoa. I hate it when it does that. I just thought it's out. So let's get back to that view. And there in the distance is the Blue Mosque, which we'll see up close next week. This is what I want to show you. That no plumbing, no indoor plumbing in many of these old houses. And some of them have been torn down by the Turkish government, but many of them still survive because they're a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They're not like wooden buildings in France, Germany, England, you know, from the Middle Ages, the same period of history. They're very distinctive Turkish designs. Okay, and they haven't been, most of them haven't been updated. So let's look at the wall built by Constantine, the emperor who founded Constantinople, to protect the city from invaders, and it held up for 1,000 years. So parts of it still survive. That's Asia across the water. That's a strait. It's the entrance of the Black Sea, right? Where so much of the fighting is now at the southern edge of Ukraine, as you may know if you've been following the news. But this is all part of Turkey, and both sides of this strait are part of the city within the city limits of Istanbul. So let's go on to the Blue Mosque. This is the last thing we'll see here. Inside the Blue Mosque is a dome that's, the arthritis now, I'll repeat it when we get to it's a must-know slide for next week. The second largest dome building in the Middle East, at least, is the Blue Mosque. And the dome is about 2/3 the size and the width and 2/3 of the height of the Hagia Sophia, about 120 feet tall. I don't think it's that wide, but it's, you know, roughly 2/3 the height of the one next door to it. And it's one of the few mosques I've seen where all the windows have stained glass. That's not typical for mosques, but no living creatures are allowed to be displayed in any mosque inside or out. So there's only geometric patterns and floral designs. Whoops, keeps doing that. So we went inside. I was then with my then girlfriend. After 5 days in Istanbul, we'd seen so many wonderful sights. Whereas our last day, a hurricane hit. And it was, I'll show you the evidence of it through one of the windows in the basement. And we heard loudspeakers in the streets, Turkish police cars saying, get off the streets, a category 2 hurricane. Well, I don't know if you've been through hurricanes, but if you have, you never forget them. It's not like a category 5, but it can do some serious damage. It can uproot trees. The winds were like 110 miles an hour. So we knew we had to duck into the nearest building that was open, and it was the Blue Mosque. And this was one of my favorite memories. The imam's children, 2 of his sons, I think they were young, both boys, came up to us and said, would you like to join us, in broken English? So they had met other American tourists, but that day we were the only Americans, as far as I know, or at least non-Turkish worshippers, or were we? Well, I'd been to mosque before, so I just thought, well, we're in their house of worship, their country, their culture. So of course, I decided that we should join the ceremony, and they just welcomed us literally like we were, old friends or family. They kept coming and checking on us, in between the imam's prayers, because the service went on for over an hour. They gave us rugs, prayer rugs, because kneeling on a hard stone floor can be bad on your knees. a couple of rugs so that they were comfortable. And they brought Turkish candy in paper cones and Turkish coffee while we were there. It was really, really warm and inviting. I'll never forget that day. Well, the hurricane raged outside the walls. And here you have these, again, their version of the Ring of Light. So let's look up at their dome, which is itself pretty impressive. 120 feet isn't 180, but it's pretty large. And you can see, look at the stained glass. It's all geometric patterns and colors and lines, or colors and shapes. No living creatures. There's the dome there in their version. You see that again, they obviously were directly inspired by, some would say copied on a slightly smaller scale, somewhat smaller, the design of the Hagia Sophia next door, with the Ring of Light and the apses and the dome resting on the corners, which that's what this is here at the bottom there. And then these walls are very similar to the ones we just saw inside the Hagia Sophia. So we'll just see about 6 more slides. You see why they call it blue, because the stone is called blue stone. It's taken from mountains in Turkey. It's a very rare stone, very hard and considered quite beautiful. The color is a very light blue color. I think it's quite lovely. That's the hurricane roaring and raging as we were inside. After the service was over, they invited us to stay until the weather. It only took a couple hours for this hurricane. Some hurricanes linger longer, but luckily this one was gone by late afternoon. But we were safe inside this mosque. And then we'll finish with a couple of views. There's Asia. They have the word Asya, they call it, which is the other half of the city limits across the straits. And these are 100, 200-year-old, maybe, some of them, at least 100, 150 years anyway. These tugboats that take you back and forth, but they do have one land bridge. Well, they may have more by now. In fact, I know they do. Frank Lloyd Wright designed a bridge for this city, and it never got built while he was alive. But there is one bridge that was there. Those towers, there's several of them, but this is the first, only one you can see from across the water. It's not a river, it's a strait between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Is the Crusader Tower, they call it, where the Crusaders took over the city and showed the disrespect I just mentioned, stabling horses at the main church. They didn't care about the local culture, even though they were fellow Christians. Look at these boats. These are well over 100 years old. Some of them closer to 150 years, handmade wooden boats, handed down from father to son to grandson for the fishing industry, which is a major, of course, part of the economy in a seaside city like this. And look, I love the Turkish flag. I mean, the color, the red with the white crescent and star. And there's your other half of the city, again, with the Crusader Tower on the Asian side. And we'll end with this last 2 views. Here are some of these old cars I was talking about. They used to have quite a few American cars from the 40s and 50s and 60s, but I don't think they do anymore. And then we'll finish with the only bridge at that time, anyway, that you could walk across between, that you could use, only footbridge that you could use to walk from one continent to another. There's no other city in the world you can do that. And there are the people and bikes and of course cars and trucks that cross this bridge every day. Okay, I hope you found that interesting. And here we go. We're ending early as I promised we would. So I'm going to stop share and stick around if you have any questions, comments, or any information, extra credit. If you're curious, that's my daughter sitting next to me. Okay. Anybody have any questions about what we just covered? Extra credit options, grades, or assignments you didn't yet get your grade back? Because I've sent them to everybody that's turned in their work on time. I think I have 1 or 2 late papers, but I don't think it's this class that I haven't yet gotten around to grading, but I will by the weekend. Any questions now from anybody? Nobody at this point. And again, I always give you guys a couple minutes if you think of something. Of course, I'm going to be checking my email every day between now and Saturday, but I don't. Saturdays are a day I don't. It's a family day for me. Yes, she's taking an online class at the JC here, if you're curious. Okay. First time she's ever done that. All these weeks you've been seeing me here, she's always been sitting next to me and helps me when the technical glitches occur, which they often do. And being, of course, a Gen Zer, she's capable of solving problems faster than I am. Anybody have any questions, comments about grading, extra credit, or anything we covered? Remember, next week, Islamic architecture. I can tell you up front, at least one of those slides will definitely be on the slide essay part of the final. And you know the format that the final will be because it's exactly the same length, same number of slides, same type of test, and worth the same amount, 100 points, or well, 105 if you do the extra credit and get a perfect score. And a few people did in each of my classes. But anyway, course extra credit, again, in general, other regular extra credit options are up to 60 points, and no one's come close. Let me just double check. I think the most I've gotten is maybe one person has 20. Yeah, so most people have no extra credit, and maybe you don't need it and you don't feel you need to, but keep in mind that that does allow you a cushion, a margin for error, whatever you want to call it. Because of course, if you were somehow not able to do as well as you thought you would on any of the first two assignments or the remaining paper, remember the second paper is due in April. Why don't I just briefly remind you of what that is? The due date is April 20th. So here we are, it's almost April. So what, 3 weeks? So you definitely want to start. If you haven't already chosen the topic for your second paper, you shouldn't wait till April 15th. Plus, some of you have income taxes to turn in, right? I've already done mine. And other tests, other papers, other classwork, of course, or just general jobs that most of us have to survive. So I've never seen it fail that people wait to do either of the two, let alone both papers toward the end of the semester. They rarely can get better than at best a B, but if they do all the extra credit, they should have that option. But why not give yourself the extra, cushion if you have the time? Okay, one more call. Yeah, well, thank you guys. Okay, and it's always a pleasure to share those. I know most people are never going to get to Istanbul, but when you watch one of those movies like Taken 2, I think it is, or The International, that was made back in the early or mid-aughts, I think, and it's still a relevant film. One of the scenes is in the Frank Lloyd Wright's building. We saw it the first week of class, the Guggenheim Museum in New York, and they shot the place all to HELL. No, of course not. They had to build a full life-size replica to scale. They weren't allowed to have a shooting, a scene with a gun battle inside one of the most famous buildings in New York, but it looks just like the real thing. And then later or earlier in the movie, they go to Istanbul and the Hagia Sophia. So extra credit options exist all over. Whenever you see a movie that has anything to do with art history or the life of an artist, and you write 2 pages about what you learned about that style of art or architecture or about that artist's career, you get 10 points. All right, one last time, anybody have any questions? All right, you guys have a good week, right? I'll see you. All
Have a
right.
good day.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Thanks. You too. Take care, guys.